So I want to turn back to the Torah portion. The Sidra for this week is a double portion. It's Chukat and Balak. And I don't want to talk really about either of them. I want to talk a little bit about our Haftorah. The Haftorah is the reading from prophets that's associated with every Torah portion. So while the Torah portion is read chronologically week after week and we go out of order only for those holy days, for the Haftorah it's always going to be linked in theme. And the themes are going to be about events, it's going to be about people, it's going to be about the calendar. And the Haftorah is always coming from the middle section of the Bible, that's the prophets. So Saturday mornings, tomorrow morning, Asher is going to be chanting among a whole bunch of folks from his family and our community. We'll be reading from the Torah scroll, but then there's always this extra reading. And the reason why I'm thinking about this today is not just because of what the Haftorah says, and I'll share it in just a moment, is because in Reformed Judaism, there came a time when we kept talking about prophetic Judaism. How the voice of the prophets was something substantial. And they put their energy into reciting verses from different prophets. And it was interesting because I think it's the hardest thing to do is to actually cite the prophets. Not because they couldn't find it, but because the prophets pretty consistently shared rebukes. And rebukes is something that most of us aren't very good at. Not only giving them, but also receiving them. And the prophets of Israel would share rebukes constantly, saying, you're missing the mark. This isn't how it's supposed to be done. And some of it was about ritual, to be sure. And some of it was outside of the ritual, about their ethics and behaviors. In the 1999 Principles of Reformed Judaism in Pittsburgh, which is a funny place for us, we might think about of where these major documents would come from. Pittsburgh is a great town, but 100 years before, the earliest of reformers in the United States gathered in Pittsburgh. It was a major Jewish center in those days. And for its centennial, they wanted to kind of go back to Pittsburgh, share a message again. And so in 1999, part of this document of principles, the statement of principles from the Reform movement's rabbis, it says, we reaffirm social action and social justice as a central prophetic focus of traditional Reform Jewish belief and practice. We affirm the mitzvah of tzedakah, setting aside portions of our earnings and our time to provide for those in need. These acts bring us closer to fulfilling the prophetic call to translate the words of Torah into the works of our hands. That's what I'm thinking about now. The prophetic call to translate words of Torah into the works of our hands. What does prophet do? A lot of us are kind of estranged from the idea. A prophet is going to be delivering God's message. It isn't just an interpretation, it's words from God. So when one prophesies, they are sharing exactly what God's message is. Now that practice in Jewish tradition is done. At a certain point, God stepped back and said, you folks have to grow up and figure these things on yourself. I'm not going to be the voice constantly speaking out. You're going to have to take your next stage of growth. And so there is no more prophecy according to Jewish tradition and our sages, but that doesn't mean there isn't a prophetic voice from our past or even from our present. This week, we're reading from the prophet Micah. Micah, in chapter 6, speaks words with God's voice, and it's an incredible message for this moment for us. God wants the people to remember the past deeds that God has done for them, even though the people of Israel at this point of their development were doing a lot of misbehaving. They were missing the mark. And what were the things that God wanted them to remember? That God liberated them from Egypt. God sent leaders like Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to guide them through a desert journey. Leadership was there. Liberation was there. God intervened so that when the king of Moab, which is read this Shabbat, when the king of Moab named Balak tries to engage a seer, somebody who is considered to be a prophet, his name is Bilam. When he tries to engage with Bilam to give a curse against the people of Israel, Bilam isn't able to do so because God intervenes and stops it. Instead, Bilam shares a blessing. That's what we're reading partially. Congregations are reading tomorrow morning. And then the other thing it says in the prophet Micah in this text is that God's just going to help these folks along the way. So in response to Micah's words, the people want to consider how to approach God with a sense of contrition, with homage. And it says, with what shall I approach the eternal? Do homage to God on high. Shall I approach God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Would the eternal be pleased with the thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil? Is the answer to provide sacrifice. And sacrifice isn't the idea of giving up. Sacrifice for them was drawing closer to God. It was giving. It was an offering. It's hard to believe that they said this next line. The next line is, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins? Would they be willing to give their own children in order to make restitution? And the answer is very clear. It is the classic expression of morality over sacrifice and worship. Micah says, God has told you, oh man, what is good and what the eternal requires of you. Only this, do justice, mishpat, to love goodness, chesed, and to walk humbly with your God. I think it's an incredible text. Out of all of the things that we could do and figure out, God wants you to be a mensch. That's it. Be a little humble in our presence. Do some good in the world. Make an act of chesed. And yes, make sure there is justice in the world around you. It's not the only voice like this. There are other prophets that do the same. Some of them are going to be familiar in the book of Amos, chapter 5. If you offer me burnt offerings, your meal offerings, I won't accept them, says God. I pay no heed to your gifts of fatlings. Spare me the sounds of your songs, and let me not hear the music of your lutes. Let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. That's the original source, by the way, is in the book of Amos. Hosea says, for I desire goodness, not sacrifice, obedience to God rather than burnt offerings. Goodness over the sacrifice and the ritual. It doesn't mean that ritual isn't important, but ritual on its own is empty. We can cite many sources, again from the prophet Isaiah, all saying the same thing. This is prophetic Judaism. And it's not just of those reformers of old. And it's not that ritual doesn't work and it's not important. They believe that it is, but it's empty if the ritual doesn't have an ethical impulse. Melissa Fay Green argues in her book, The Temple Bombing. Some of you might have came across this book before. She says in her book that the term prophetic Judaism was coined around the time of the 1958 white supremacist attack on a Reformed synagogue in Atlanta called the Temple. The Temple at the time had a rabbi named Jacob Rothschild, and he was very outspoken. Green writes, Rothschild was not the only Southern rabbi in the 1950s to make a connection between the words of the prophets and the African-American movement for civil equality. A dozen or more Southern rabbis stood for integration. Because of these dozen, more or less, the phrase prophetic Judaism entered the modern lexicon of the Reformed Jewish movement. Interesting. All folks in the Jewish community speak about the prophets. All will cite what they taught. All will note their rebuke. But there was a time in American Jewish history that saw a prophetic Judaism as saying, the time is now to respond. And over time, the Reform movements, the pendulum starts to swing again. And there's a desire to learn more, have the rabbis on a lower bima. There's a time when we should introduce more Hebrew. And there's an effort to bring tradition back to Reform synagogues. So Torah learning is wonderful, connections to Israel is wonderful, a re-embracing of Jewish tradition, things that were really discarded before are now starting to be reclaimed and redefined. All beautiful things. Maybe it's because of the pride after the 1967 war in Israel. Could it be that ideas before the Holocaust of everything, doing things in a ritualistic way that were rational, and if they weren't rational, to let them go? Well, rational thought is devastated after a Holocaust. Non-rational, emotional starts to emerge, and then we have a return to tradition, all of which I think is amazing. But what about the prophets? Where's the rebuke? You just have to listen to what the rabbi says, and you'll say, oh, I like the sermon or I don't like the sermon. I got to tell you, folks, it wasn't my idea. These rebukes, the challenges, they're from our prophets. What does Isaiah say? Hear the word of the Eternal, you chieftains of Sodom. He's not pulling any punches. You would not renew my contract if I said this. Give ear to our God's instructions. What need have I of all of your sacrifice, says God? I'm sated with burnt offerings of rams, suet of fatlings, blood of bulls. I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. That you come to appear before me, who asked that of you? But then there's a very clear message. It's not about the new moons and the fixed seasons, according to Isaiah. It says, and when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I won't listen. Your hands are stained with crime. Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wrong. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. Where's the voice of our prophets today? Have we become uncomfortable with hearing a rebuke? I know some are. And these last number of weeks I've been saying, it's time not only to give answers, but to do some more listening and introspection. These days, in lots of American synagogues, we read the Haftarah, spend hardly any time on it. Doesn't sound like a prophetic Judaism anymore. And I believe that Judaism is compelling, all of it, even the parts I disagree with. But it's mine, so I can, and it's yours, so you can too. We have the same yearnings as our ancestors, and yet we live in a totally different kind of a world. The Haftarah was to make connections between the Torah's texts and peoples and events and institutions and reinforce all of that with messages from the prophets. But I think we can do more. The prophetic voice is one to help us advance a society, change us to walk in God's ways. God has told you what to do and what the Eternal really requires of you. It's only this, to do justice, love acts of chesed and goodness, and to walk humbly with your God. I want to leave you with these closing thoughts. We have a reading in our prayer book that I often share. It's in English, and it starts off, wherever you live, it's eternally Egypt. And I like the reading and I hate the reading. And some of you know in the synagogue who are part of it are familiar with this reading. But it's been adapted from what the writer originally wrote. The writer is Professor Michael Walzer. He's a leading political philosopher. And he wrote this teaching, and I think his words are even better than what's in the prayer book. He wrote, wherever we live, it is probably Egypt. There really is a better place, a promised land. And there really is a promised time. And there is no way to get from here to there, from now to then, except by joining together and marching, and sometimes stumbling through the wilderness. watching this time not for signs and wonders, but for an opportunity to act. Can we reclaim the prophetic voice of Micah, Amos, and Isaiah? Maybe we can add to them. I know there's lots of people that think that Dr. King is like a prophet. Could be. Could we add his voice? Well, we often do. What about Langston Hughes? What about Greta Thunberg? What about Malala? Can we bring other voices, other people's, their prophetic voices? We don't turn them into idols or prophets, but maybe the prophetic voice isn't over. So I want to share one prophetic voice with you, and this is where we can close. July 4th weekend, for me, more than I ever have before. I'm struggling some, not because I love America any less, because I don't. But my eyes are opened a little bit more widely, and I'm seeing another perspective that I didn't encounter before. So I want to read a prophetic voice from Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by anyone above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is the air we breathe. So here's to the prophetic voice, friends. Let's see if we can raise them up, be inspired, and do the good so that the ritual that reminds us of our responsibilities and brings us closer to the divine, that it will all be in balance. The work, the love, the actions, the prayers, the faith, the heart. We need that all in alignment.